The bottles clinked like small bells as the milk truck eased through the service gate, frost seaming each lip of glass, breath blooming in pale clouds from driver and sentry alike. Dawn bled up from the mesquite flats beyond the fence. Lucia Romano pressed her thumb into the raised eagle on a green camp script chit and waited for the government grocery to open, sleeves pulled over her knuckles, the air sharp enough to make her eyes sting. When the fluorescents crackled alive, the room glowed a clinical white, and she saw them, a pyramid of oranges, skins pocked with oil, each lit like a tiny sun in captivity. She hadn't smelled that brightness since childhood Saturdays in Naples, when markets shouted and Mussolini still promised plenty. Here, in a Department of Justice family camp in Crystal City, Texas, under watchtowers and wire, an enemy's child could eat fresh fruit. The shock came as anger, then as heat behind the eyes, then as a clean desire to make the sweetness last. She stepped forward with ration coupons and the scrip the clerk called coupon checks, the ledger ruled in pencil as neat as parade stripes. A bell dinged when the scale hit weight. The orange was cool in her palm. When she broke the peel, oil misted her sleeve, and the whole room smelled like a lost country. Her daughter, Nella, looked up from the hem of Lucia's skirt, as if the scent were a voice calling them home. "Piano, piccola," Lucia whispered, switching to English for the clerk. "Just one today." Beyond the slatted windows the sentry walked his beat, boots biting the caliche. He glanced in and kept going, uninterested in the miracle on the counter. America, she would learn, specialized in miracles treated as ordinary. Records show Crystal City as a family internment facility, not an army POW compound. Women and children lived by posted schedules and printed rules, under Major Ruth Ellison's calm signatures on requisitions for milk, ice, boards, bleach, and quinine. The quartermaster pipeline reached even here. Class 1 perishable deliveries, reefer cars hissing on sidings, trucks scheduled in columns that looked like scripture to drivers like Private. Walter Wally Beeman. It was doctrine, not whim, that enemy dependents in federal custody would be fed to American standards. The Geneva language said equivalent to depot troops, and in practice that meant fruit, eggs, milk, and vegetables cycling through menus predictable as reveille. Where the record runs thin, one can say the first taste would have come with a startle and a doubt. Is this allowed? But ledgers confirm the pattern. Milk arrived in cold snaps, ice came in heat that warped the horizon. Garden rows were allotted by number. Lucia paid, slipped the orange into her bag with 2 carrots, still beaded with cold, and counted the remaining chits. The clerk, hair pinned under a kerchief, stamped the ration book with a rubber block that thunked like a gavel. "Next," she called. Routine washed the moment in bureaucracy, but routine was the armature holding the miracle upright. Outside, the dust smelled faintly of iron. Laundry lines pulled tight like staff lines across a sheet of music. Behind a barrack, a radio caught a San Antonio station and found war news bristling with names that arrived as cities and numbers. Lucia imagined the hunger wrapped around those names: breadgrams cut again, bitter barley coffee, a neighbour's gums bleeding from scurvy. She thought of her husband, somewhere past the map's edge, and shelved the thought because it weighed more than she could carry to breakfast. Nella sat at the small table, a tin plate shining like a parade ground sun. "Adesso?" the girl asked. "Adesso," Lucia said. She peeled carefully, saving each strip of rind in a spiral. The scent rose like the first note in a hymn. The wedge broke clean. Juice ran into Nella's smile. For a heartbeat, Lucia felt anger again, that the one thing Italy could no longer promise had been made effortless by their captors, and then she understood a different geometry. The orange was not generosity, it was proof of capacity. A nation that could refrigerate mercy could mobilize anything. The compressor in the grocery's back room throbbed like a distant engine. The wire sang in the wind. By the time the whistle blew for roll, Lucia had wrapped the remaining wedges in waxed paper and slipped them into Nella's pocket. The clerk stacked milk caps, counting under her breath. A cat curled under the coal bin, chin on paws, tail flicking at newsprint. The sentry lit a cigarette, exhaled into cold that erased his breath. Whether he knew it or not, he stood on a supply line that ran from fields to ice plants to rail sidings to this small, ordinary miracle. Lucia wiped the table and gathered the peels into a neat, fragrant coil. She would dry them on the sill to scent the barrack and remind herself that sweetness could be preserved if you had the right machinery. She tied her scarf, smoothed her skirt, and stepped into the sun as the day opened like a ledger waiting for numbers. A refrigerator door breathed out a ghost of cold as the corporal swung it wider, the hinges whispering like a secret. Sergeant Angelo Balestra, captured near Zaguan and processed through Oran and a Liberty ship's hold, stood on the painted line and felt his skin pebble as if the chill could reach memory. Hooks hung like empty notes on a staff. Lamb quarters glowed faintly under frost. Crates were stenciled with tidy letters: potatoes, onions, carrots. Behind them, milk bottles chimed gently. He had expected punishment with the ship and rail. He found temperature and the authority that came with it. Camp Hereford, Deaf Smith County, Texas. Double fences, guard towers, floodlights, telephone lines linking each post ran on schedules that felt like laws of nature. The mess sergeant tapped a pencil on a ration worksheet, nodded, and waved the line forward. "Move it, paisans." Angelo moved. There are ledgers to prove the menu cycle: fruit, eggs, milk, stews thick enough to stand a spoon, bread doled to weight. The US Army applied Geneva's equivalent to depot troops standard with bureaucratic decency and a hard eye for labour output. Angelo did not know the wording. He knew the taste when the spoon touched his mouth, a sweetness that did not belong to war. The milk washed the dust of Tunisia from his throat in one swallow. He remembered the bitter, barley-stretched coffee of the last months before capture, the grey bread that went light in the hand. The men behind him muttered first prayers, then jokes. A Calabrian corporal asked if America seasoned everything with ice. They laughed softly because laughter cost nothing and steadied hands. Technicalities mattered because they were the story. Reefer cars held at 34 to 40 degrees, spoilage thresholds calculated like artillery tables, Class 1 issue rates in ounces and calories, depot bypass authorizations so perishables could move point to point. Hereford's walk-in coolers hummed steady, powered by a grid that did not blink when the panhandle wind leaned against buildings and made the towers sing. The camp map showed rings of wire, barracks in grids, latrines, a chapel improvised from a supply shed, and beyond the perimeter, fields that would later take POW labour under armed supervision to pull onions and carrots and potatoes from dust that rose in sheets like smoke. The men saw none of the diagrams, only the result, grazing light on clean tables, bowls clacking like canteens in a march. They ate until the ache behind their eyes loosened. Angelo had marched from the last Tunisian hills into a funnel of surrender, watched desert brews under tank tracks, learned to sleep with boots on and fists under his cheek. The ship crossed grey water with the hold stinking of humanity and diesel, and then America rose not as a shoreline but as a process. The Hereford platform was swept. The guards spoke without shouting. The trucks idled at the place they should. He felt a private fear born of competence. If America could keep milk cold through rail changes and time zones, what else could it keep? War, he understood, was not only bullets but the arrival of things at the promised hour in the specified condition. He cleaned his bowl and tasted orange peel on his lip where a wedge had torn. He did not remember taking it. Some mess corporal had stuck it on top of the bread as if to prove a theorem. He pulled kitchen police duty 2 days later, scrubbing pans, then unloading a truck that exhaled winter when its door lifted. The corporal calling crate weights spoke in quartermaster patter that sounded like poetry. 72 pounds, 32 degrees, 17 boxes remaining. Angelo began to understand the grammar. Numbers were the rank structure of the American system. Obedience ran on decimals. When he sat in the chapel, he found not salvation but silence, and in silence his first clear thought since Oran. The thing that frightens me isn't their weapons, it is their capacity to make rules into meals. Where records don't capture his exact words, one can say he would have thought in that shape, because letters home use the same language. Everything works. Even the ice. Night dropped like a lid, the towers clicked to floodlight, and the wire sang a different note. Angelo lay on his bunk, hands folded on his chest, the barrack wood ticking as it cooled. He heard the compressor through 2 walls, a steady heartbeat that ignored sentry changes and the coughs of the man in the next bed. He recalled the city hunger shadowing his aunt's kitchen in Palermo, the way she cut bread in thinner slices and accused her knife of treason. Beneath a foreign sky, he had eaten until the mind stopped counting. He understood, dimly, that decency expressed at scale was not charity but strength. The camp slept, and the cold engine kept humming, decree transformed into a sound you barely heard but could not stop feeling. The paper rasped like sand under Major Ruth Ellison's fountain pen as she initialed morning requisitions. Milk per capita adjusted for heat index, ice blocks scheduled for afternoon delivery, a crate of seed packets to be issued for family plots, boards for walkways because winter mud had been up to the knees, her phrase now echoing through carbon copies. She kept a stethoscope on the blotter to remind herself that numbers touched bodies. The clinic cards told a story: weight gain in children who drank scheduled milk, fewer fainting spells when breakfasts included fruit, fewer infections when planks kept bare feet out of standing water. Another story arrived in clippings: the coddling talkers who imagined enemy children growing fat on American generosity. She pinched the bridge of her nose, then called for private. Walter Beeman, the quartermaster driver who could translate tonnage into minutes the way a good teacher turns chalk into light. Wally came with cap tucked under his arm and a sheet of reefer schedules that looked like a map of the nervous system. He explained, as always, that perishables skipped depots when possible, that straight-through runs kept vitamins from evaporating into delay, that the compressor's hum acted like prophylaxis you could measure on a morbidity chart. He talked temperature bands and spoilage thresholds, and she nodded, hearing the same calm she found in Army Medical Department manuals. Apply doctrine, repeat procedure, measure outcomes. Where the record stops, one can note she likely smiled at his line, "Victory rides cold," because she wrote it in a margin weeks later. She drafted a request to enlarge garden rows, arguing that tomatoes and greens were medicine disguised as colour, that work steadied minds, that control of a small plot restored dignity without loosening security. She had served in county hospitals before the war, watched dust and hunger turn the body's simplest systems into enemies. The camp was clean by comparison, but cleanliness at this scale was a campaign. She fought with chlorine and clipboards, with weekly talks in the mess hall on hand-washing and food handling, with polite reminders to guards that shouting wasted energy and authority alike. The sentries learned to speak in declarative sentences. The mothers learned the rhythm of scrip and stamps, the feel of a ledger that balanced because the grid behind it was true. She signed for more ice, because even in winter the dryers could fail, and nothing soured a day like milk gone off. She requested more boards, because mud did not respect wire, rank, or nationality. She approved seed packets. She underlined milk allotments. The clinic cards began to slope down and away from anemia. There was an impossible number she used when anyone asked how America could spare fruit for aliens and enemies. One factory at Willow Run rolling a B-24 off the line roughly every 60 minutes at 1944 peak, an aircraft an hour. If a single plant could launch a bomber per lunch break, the Republic could refrigerate oranges without breaking stride. The point, she would say, was not extravagance, but discipline. The system ran because drivers hit timetables, cooks hit temperatures, and clerks hit neat lines on paper where ink dried to certainty. Democracy expressed itself here as schedules honoured. That afternoon, a dust devil ran fast down the main lane, scattering newspaper and a child's drawing of a house that looked uncannily like the barrack it fluttered against. Ruth caught the paper, smoothing it with the reflex of a nurse calming a sheet, and handed it back to the girl. She stopped by the grocery. Lucia Romano stood at the counter with carrots and a loaf, counting scrip with lips moving in Italian. Ruth nodded and moved on without comment. Authority worked best when it was unremarkable. On the way to the clinic, she passed the cooler shed and felt the low thrum through the siding. The sound pleased her more than any speech. It meant the chain held. Fields to packing, sheds to rail, to truck, to shelf, to hand, to mouth, to health. It meant tomorrow could look like today, only steadier. That night she wrote her weekly memo to the district, arguing for more boards and noting that family gardens likely reduce clinic load by 10% during summer months due to increased vitamin intake and improved morale. She apologised in a footnote for the imprecision. The reply would come with signatures. The boards would arrive on a truck, the garden rows would be measured with twine. When she capped her pen, she listened again to the camp's nocturne, the wind at the wire, the distant compressor, a guard's footsteps measuring his 100-yard beat, and thought, not for the first time, that ethics were logistics wearing their Sunday gloves. She turned off the lamp and left the office in darkness, so complete the stars looked like cold rivets holding up the night. Lantern light made a yellow coin on the ballast as the switchman checked his watch and raised 2 fingers, the signal clean as a bugle call. Private Walter Wally Beeman stood on the catwalk of a refrigerator car and felt the roof thrum under his boots, the metal alive with cold made to travel. He loved exactitudes, 34 to 40 degrees for produce, 50 for eggs, milk kept where cream would not separate and morale would not curdle. He loved the way a train could turn theory into breakfast by moving at a promised speed between promised points. In late summer 1944, his line ran from packing sheds through night towns to sidings where mess sergeants waited with clipboards, and from there to places like Hereford's walk-in coolers and Crystal City's grocery with its humming fluorescents and neat stacks of scrip. He did not think of it as mercy. He thought of it as correct. The convoy coupled and the air set with a hiss, the engineer's gloved hand laying the throttle forward like a priest laying on hands. Wally kept the car sealed, thermometers read from a brass port, pencils sharp in his pocket. There was doctrine for this, quartermaster manuals laying down how perishables could bypass depots and go straight to consuming stations, reducing the interval where vitamins slipped into abstractions. He could recite weight limits and turnarounds as if from catechism. So many tons per consist, so many minutes of dwell before temperature crept beyond tolerance, so many hours before broccoli sulked and potatoes remembered they were roots and wanted to go soft. He made jokes sound like warnings. "Miss a window and you're not feeding men," he told new drivers. "You're feeding ditch water." The road ran flat and then rose, shadows of windmills turning slow as if pinched by a giant's fingers. The night smelled of creosote and cold iron, and a sweetness he always associated with apples even when the cars held onions. He kept one eye on his watch and the other on a constellation of signal lamps that meant he would make Hereford by 0300. He watched a yard slide past where tanks in transit crouched like steel beetles, and he thought with simple pride that the same discipline that kept milk sweet kept engines oiled, K-rations on time, and penicillin flowing to wards where lives were held at body temperature and a nurse's steadiness. The Republic's strength, in his view, lay not in shouting but in keeping promises to thermometers. At the siding, a mess sergeant with forearms like truncheons signed for crates as if signing for a platoon's good behaviour. Wally listened to numbers pile up, issue rates in ounces, the arithmetic of hunger undone 1 digit at a time. He could not see the POWs inside, Men like Angelo lined up under fluorescents, but he knew the effect of a car arriving at 0340 instead of 0520. Breakfast would have fruit that still tasted like trees and milk that had not become a story about failure. He took pride in a failure unoccurring. He took pride, too, that civilians inside Crystal City would wake to a grocery that felt like a small-town store instead of an annex to a war. It was not sentiment, it was victory expressed as routine. On the return leg, he dozed against the door latch and thought of home in Missouri, of a mother who ironed on Saturdays and a father who fixed clocks. The notion comforted him, a nation of tinkerers turned outward, patience scaled into factories and grids. He had read about Willow Run, B-24s rolling out like a clock striking the hour, a bomber an hour at peak. He memorized the number the way a boy memorizes batting averages. If a single plant could do that, how hard was it to keep lettuce cold? The line blurred deliberately until airplanes and cabbage sat on the same shelf labelled throughput. They rolled past a farmhouse where one square of light burned as if someone had woken to a child's cry or to check a stove. He thought of Crystal City and the clink of bottles, of a little girl's mouth shining with citrus, of a camp doctor who wrote memos like prayers with numbers at the end. He checked the thermometer again, tapped the rim, then tucked the board away as the signal swung them west. The night smelled like rain that would not arrive. He felt the car's cold in his bones, a clean ache, and decided it was a good pain, evidence that he belonged to a machine large enough to make kindness arrive on time. When dawn drew a silver edge along the horizon, he stood and stretched and imagined a mess door swinging open to bowls and steam and a moment, brief as a whistle, when men believed in breakfast more than in war. The bus door folded open to rows of green, the smell of soil rising when the first fork turned. Angelo Balestra stepped down with a dozen others wearing the small armband of an Italian service unit, the armistice of Cassibile, having made new work from old captivity. An American sergeant with a stopwatch and a half-smile read off instructions while a farmer adjusted his hat and pointed to onions, carrots and potatoes, gone ready all at once. Sun lay flat on the high plains, hard light that made tools look ceremonial. Angelo inhaled, surprised by sweetness in the dirt, and felt the guarded relief of a man earning calories with hands that had lately known only surrender. Briefings were brisk, quotas per row, safety rules, water discipline, the guard's authority as absolute in the field as at the fence. Privileges followed production. The sergeant made the arithmetic plain, more boxes, more letters, more canteen access. Angelo learned the pace the way he had learned drill, by listening for the counts beating under the wind. He knew this was not liberty. He knew, too, that a nation that could organise mercy could also organise labour until it resembled a kind of civic order. Trucks came and went in timed circuits. A flatbed idled at the margin like a patient animal. Reefer schedules braided with farm schedules so tightly that the day felt pre-notched. Angelo laughed once, short and private, when he realised he was measuring progress not in steps, but in crate weights and thermometer readings. The sergeant spoke the language of throughput. The farmer spoke yield. Angelo learned to translate. Load steady, keep boxes shaded, report bruised produce so it could be cooked first, prevent waste, as if waste were treason. The figures turned personal when the mess that night held carrots so sweet they seemed sugared. He would have written to his aunt in Palermo, had it been possible, to say that America seasoned everything with temperature and time. Farmers spoke of labour shortages, sons overseas, daughters running tractors. The war had bitten into every household, but the fields stood combed and orderly, and the packing shed moved like a quiet machine. Angelo watched Wally's truck arrive on the minute and back neatly to the ramp. He saw paper collars numbered on crates like tags on cattle. He felt a strange pride when a foreman said "good hands" without looking up from his tally sheet. He had been called worse in uniforms he had earned with vows now voided by history. Here his oath was to the clock, The workday closed with the sky boiled purple and red. The guard handed out extra bread with that studied neutrality Americans wore when kindness would complicate authority. The bus rattled back toward Hereford, men talking softly about food and sleep and the chance of rain. Angelo sat by the window and watched dust follow the fence lines like smoke that had forgotten its fire. At the camp, the cooler door opened and breathed winter. The mess sergeant stacked their harvest onto the metal shelves with the same quiet respect he gave to meat and milk. Angelo thought of a statistic he had heard from Wally, hundreds of thousands of POW Labour Days logged in American agriculture, and tried to imagine the acres those days had saved from loss. He could not. The number was too large to picture, so he held a smaller image. A carrot snapped clean, the sound like a twig on a mountain trail. Where the record grows spare, one can say the men likely slept hard and woke sore and a little proud. The Italian service unit stitched enemy hands into the American food chain without drama. Boxes, rails, ice, mess. If there was doubt, it softened under practicalities. Angelo's prayer, if he made one, would have been a thing of inventory. Bodies intact, trucks unbroken, thermometers true, dinner hot. Through the barrack wall, the cooler hummed a familiar, consoling note, proof that the day's labour had entered a system that turned time into nourishment and nourishment into order. He fell asleep, watching the slow sweep of a guard's flashlight like a clock hand writing patience onto wood. Frost silvered the bed springs Lucia had wired into a trellis, the metal twanging softly when she tested the tie. Winter 1944–45 arrived like a discipline rather than a storm, cold that taught you to ration breath and gratitude both. She watered seedlings from a coffee tin while Nella stamped her feet on the plank walk Ruth Ellison had scrounged from district stores. Mud was a campaign all its own, Ruth had written. Boards and bleach were her artillery. The camp woke to the clink of bottles and the rattle of a coal scuttle, and somewhere a radio murmured headlines that seemed to belong to other planets. Lucia tucked a tomato leaf between finger and thumb, inhaling a green, sharp scent that made the fences fade for a heartbeat. The gardens did work that memos could only promise. Old country skills reappeared overnight. Rows straight as drill teams, beans climbing with immigrant ambition, gossip traded across furrows. Italian and German women compared soups like truce terms, their children sharing chores and words, mistranslating into friendship. Lucia learned to dry peels and to can with borrowed rings, to stretch flavour the way a tailor stretches cloth. When milk and ice arrived on schedule despite cold snaps, she recognised the moral kept in the mechanical, mercy measured. She had thought abundance would shame her. Instead, it steadied her hands. Ruth's clinic notes stacked into a graph that pleased her like a hymn sung on key. Fewer fainting spells, fewer sores that wouldn't heal, fewer fights in the ration line when produce appeared as promised. She lobbied for more boards after a rain turned the parade ground into chocolate, recorded scorpion stings with the even script of a woman who had decided fear was a poor clerk, and ordered extra soap because children were learning to play at the pump. She sent a note to Wally asking that his drivers treat the plank lanes like supply routes, not shortcuts. Wheels split boards the way rumour split trust. He answered with a schedule and a joke about thermometers stronger than sermons. There were limits. Headlines in spring would harden into policy shifts that pinched calories, and Ruth knew from county hospitals how quickly bodies register subtraction. She prepared by stockpiling recipes for substitution and by arguing, whenever the occasion allowed, that humane rations were not charity but control. If you wanted quiet labour and clean barracks, you fed people on time and gave them a patch of earth that could answer to their hands. Lucia would not have used that language, but she felt its truth each time a row held straight and a tomato set without splitting. One afternoon, a dust devil unstitched the main lane while a delivery crew wrestled ice blocks toward the cooler. Lucia and a German neighbour caught a runaway milk crate between them, laughing at the absurdity of rescue within wire. "Danke," the woman said, and Lucia answered "Prego," then tried "thank you," because gratitude sounded sturdier in the camp's official language. Nella, solemn with the importance of work, carried carrots to the kitchen and stood on tiptoe to pass them to a clerk who weighed each with the reverence of a sacristan. A sentry paused, considered the scene, then walked on, the set of his shoulders suggesting that ordinary kindness, performed quietly, supervised from a distance, was the camp's preferred climate. Night drew its seam, and the barracks ticked as wood released the day. Ruth wrote her weekly memo by lamplight, the nib whispering, "Boards, bleach, boots, milk holding steady, gardens likely reducing clinic load by 1/10, request for more twine." She underlined "likely," the word she used when data lagged the truth she could already see in children's cheeks. Lucia shelved cooling jars and tied tomato vines in tidy knots, hands learning the camp's grammar of care. Wally, somewhere on the road, checked a thermometer through a brass port and grinned at a number that meant breakfast would arrive before the wind remembered to be cruel. The compressor thrummed. The wire sang. A tomato leaf brushed the window and wrote a green shadow on the sill, a signature of patience promising taste when the season said yes and the system said now. Spring 1945 arrived with headlines instead of birdsong. "Feeding the enemy," a paper snapped, and the phrase climbed fences faster than dust. The Provost Marshal General cut ration scales for non-workers and tightened substitutions. In Crystal City and Hereford, the change didn't bang like a drum, it clicked like a ratchet. Bread slices thinned, butter dots shrank. Stew stretched with beans already doing their share. Major Ruth Ellison reran her clinic numbers and felt her jaw set. She had seen what happened when calories slipped, anxiety first, then frayed tempers, then small injuries that multiplied like rumours. She sharpened her pencil and began a memo whose argument would be made from ounces and hours, not adjectives. She wrote in the plain voice that persuades tired men. Geneva-equivalent rations kept tempers cool, injuries rare, clinic visits brief. Cut calories and the cost returned through another door. More fainting, more petty fights, slower work details, frayed trust. "Humane calories are not indulgence," she would have written, but control. Where records are thin, one can safely say she included incident rates per 100 men, output per hour on harvest crews, and a line reminding headquarters that children under 5 converted milk to quiet with the reliability of a metronome. She asked that cuts spare workers and the very young. At Hereford, the rumour turned into taste. Breakfast bowls felt lighter. Men who had learned to trust the clock felt their stomachs argue with policy. Sergeant Angelo Balestra watched a spoon hover over soup suddenly thin and felt an old word rise in the dark like breath on a cold night. La femme. It was not starvation, but its ghost. Persuasive, sleepless, fluent in subtraction. He took extra details, traded favours, turned shovel and crate and sweat back into bread. A guard once slipped him a heel with eyes fixed on the middle distance, as if kindness were gravity and required no witness. Friction started small, an elbow at the breadline, a growl over seconds that should not have been asked. Ruth's incident curve ticked upward. She went to the mess and stood in the steam, listening. The sergeant had substitution tables, so many ounces of beans for so many of meat, but substitution has a morale curve and manuals don't write that math. Ruth asked for last week's weights, the menu cycle, the complaint log. She spoke to a guard in low tones about the way authority travels best. Steady voice, clean boots, full pans. Private Walter Wally Beeman arrived with his ledger speech. "If reefers land before 0340, breakfast tastes like trees," he said, tapping a thermometer through a brass port. "After 0500, Peel stands in for promise. Waste stayed under 5% when schedules held, jumped when fear made men hoard or cooks play safe. The cold doesn't lie," he said. "Men do to themselves when they're hungry." He set his pencil on the minute he meant to hit, a driver's oath in wood and lead. In Wally's world, Mercy rode timetables and carried a clipboard. Some Italians would later recall foraging rattlesnakes and grasshoppers when rations pinched hardest. At Hereford, that story belongs to late summer, after surrender papers and before patients recovered. Angelo did not hunt snakes. He leaned into work. The mess crew, caught between tables and faces, ladled evenly and pretended not to hear the room's unsettled breathing. Rumour blew in and out like a screen door, big cuts coming, then big restorations, then nothing at all. The cooler answered with its single note, "Hold at temperature, hold the line." Ruth's memo moved up the chain with neat columns and verbs that didn't blink. She asked that Geneva equivalents be restored for workers and small children, and that substitutions stay within the menu's moral tolerance. She attached Wally's schedules and a clinic note showing fainting episodes doubling under the cut and falling again when calories rose. The answer returned as pallet weight, not prose. Bowles felt right again. The mess sergeant stopped studying the doorway like a man waiting for a judge. The breadline rediscovered silence. Angelo exhaled the way a station exhales when a delayed train finally leaves. He ate until the ache behind his eyes softened. He told himself the machine had bent but not broken, that a system large enough to keep milk cold across time zones would notice when anger made the wrong kind of noise. He believed it because the wire sang its neutral note and the compressor kept time like a drummer who never tires. Wally backed to the ramp at 0339 and smiled at a number he trusted more than speeches. Where the record goes quiet, the contour still holds. The crisis passed not because anyone won an argument, but because a nation kept its appointments. Ruth filed her incident sheets beside requisitions for boards and bleach, as if ethics could be archived between lumber and soap. Angelo lay on his bunk and listened to the clean machine sound that meant breakfast would arrive on schedule. Wally checked one last gauge, tapped the rim with a pencil, and drove into a night that smelled like creosote and rain that would likely not arrive. The map looked like a nervous system nailed to cork. Red pins for fields, blue for ice plants, black for railheads, twine pulled taut so roots could hum even while the room held its breath. Wally Beeman clicked pushpins like a man loading a stripped-down kind of ammunition. He wasn't performing. He was building a sentence Ruth Ellison needed to deliver to men who respected numbers more than nouns. Truth at this size could feel like weather. You didn't argue with it, you prepared for it. He traced the spine of the cold chain the way an infantry officer traces a firing line. Fields to packing sheds, sheds to reefers, reefers to sidings, sidings to kitchens and groceries where thermometers were as sacred as guidons. "We keep produce between 34 and 40, he said, tapping a thermometer pinned to the cork. "Eggs want 50. Milk acts like a private, does better with supervision." A short arc from Crystal City to the rail spur looked like a stitch in the earth. The figures made it sing. Dwell times, turnarounds, spoilage thresholds. Ruth laid a clinic chart beside the routes. Fewer fainting spells the weak fruit arrived before dawn. Less infection when boards and bleach caught up to rain. Reduced fights in the ration line when vegetables were on schedule. She did not dramatize. She graphed. Feeding at Geneva equivalents did not coddle the enemy, she wrote in a steady hand. It preserved labour, minimized incidents, reduced clinic load and vindicated doctrine. She circled workers, maintain higher scale, the pencil digging a shallow trench in the paper. Wally delivered totals that tightened the room. "Across the United States," he said, "we've handled roughly 425,000 Axis POWs. About 50,000 are Italians, hundreds of main and branch camps, and in agriculture." He tapped a ledger, roughly 265,000 POW labourers over the war years. The numbers landed without flourish, men in khaki straightened. Angelo's hours bent inside that sum until his hands seemed to appear under the pins, ghosted through paper and twine. Ruth moved the conversation from food to everything the same discipline could carry. If oranges could arrive fresh under watchtowers, so could penicillin, morphine ampules, surgical tape. A reefer car was an ethic on wheels. Temperature and time spoke every language in the camp. She watched a captain's pencil stop fidgeting as she slid across the incident tables. Quiet was a strategic resource, she said. Geneva-equivalent menus purchased it cheaply. The ledger's tone made agreement feel like a professional courtesy, not a concession. The impossible part was not one number, but their coincidence. Hundreds of thousands in custody, fed like depot troops, while factories pushed steel, aluminum and rubber through other arteries without starving a nation at war. The grid held across hundreds of sites and towns that understood trains better than speeches. Wally closed by, pointing at the clock. "Make the time, make the meal," he said. "Miss the time, make an excuse." No one in the room mistook that for poetry. It was doctrine in work boots. The captain initialed Ruth's memo with a short pencil mark that moved food like a platoon. Pins came out of the map, but the routes stayed bright behind the eyes, the way roads glow after you drive them 10 times in rain. Wally wound the twine into a loop like a lariat and set the thermometers in a cigar box with more reverence than a deacon gives a chalice. They stepped into air that smelled of creosote and cold iron. A reefer door clanged shut. The padlock clicked. Somewhere down the line a whistle tested its throat. They said little. The map's after-image hung in the room like a flag you could not untack. Ruth pocketed her copy of the schedule and felt the pleasant weight of evidence, the kind that quiets arguments before they start. Wally touched the rim of his cap and walked toward his truck with the unhurried step of a man who knows every minute he will meet for the next 6 hours and what freight he will deliver to each. The evening wind made the wire sing its neutral hymn, and the camp listened without needing translation. Late summer 1945 pulled thunderheads out of the horizon like ships mounting from heat haze. An onion field near the fence went ready all at once while the wind rehearsed a storm. The call ran from packing shed to camp gate to quartermaster yard, and vehicles began to converge as if all were speaking the same urgent language. Angelo Balestra stepped off the bus and counted crates out of habit. A guard with dust on his brim said, "Steady pace, gentlemen," as if saying grace. The first fat drops hit like thrown pebbles. Angelo's crew moved in rows, boxes shaded with burlap, hands remembering rhythm even as grit bit eyes and tongues. Wally Beeman rerouted a reefer 3 towns out, swapping priorities with the kind of courtesy that sounds like threat when time is the weapon. A dispatcher no one had met came up on the radio, authority built entirely of minutes and junctions. The storm should have been the story. The system made the storm a detail. When wind hit hard, the ramp held. Ruth Ellison likely stood in her doorway as the barometer fell, plotting clinic loads against twisted ankles and heat stroke that sometimes rode a storm's front edge. She sent a runner to stage space in the cooler. She called the mess and asked for extra coffee for inbound shifts. The memo would be written after. Now she worked in verbs: brace, clear, receive. Rain found tin and made a music of it, but inside the shed hands made a steadier song, counting, stacking, signing. Angelo's crew beat the worst of it by minutes that felt like medals. Boxes stacked, tarps tied, signatures cut into damp paper. Wally backed the reefer into the slot precise as punctuation. The flatbed's brakes squealed and then held. The ramp took the load. Hands passed boxes man to man like a prayer that does not change with weather. The storm shouldered past with sullen dignity, and the shed kept time. When quiet came, it sounded like competence. When men breathed, it tasted like onion sweetness and iron. Bread moved down the line with no speeches attached, and that was the point. Orders travelled in verbs. Thank you travelled in actions. Angelo took 3 bites and wiped his fingers on his shirt because a shirt was a rag before it was a uniform. He thought of the number Wally had said once. Hundreds of thousands of POW Labour Days in American fields. and tried again to imagine the acres inside that number. Failing that, he settled for a truer image. 12 men, 20 minutes, a crop kept. Every third chapter asks for an impossible statistic, and the day carried one in its pocket. Wally told it later, half grinning because good numbers feel like magic tricks that obey physics. A Liberty ship, he said, had once gone from keel to launch in 4 days and a handful of hours. Steel conjured by shifts, rivets, and a republic that decided time itself could be retooled. If a ship could be born between a Thursday and a Monday, a convoy could beat a storm by 20 minutes. No one argued with arithmetic spoken in weather. Lucia Romano spent the evening setting jars on a shelf while rain tapped out its surrender. She could smell the cooler's winter breath through 2 rooms and a corridor and took comfort in its lack of drama. Nella slept with an orange rind in her pocket because children make sacraments as a way of staying brave. Ruth wrote 2 lines in the day's log, storm-skirted, harvest saved, and added a note to request more tarps before the month turned. Wally phoned the yard to reset tomorrow's priorities. The guards walked their beats under a sky scrubbed clean. Boots spoke softly where mud had packed. Angelo lay with his hands behind his head and felt the good ache of a day that made sense. If he dreamed, it would have been of boxes moving as if pulled by the same steady hand that keeps clocks honest. The wire hummed a neutral chord. The compressor answered with its clean mechanical psalm. Somewhere a child turned in sleep, and the orange rind let go one last small oath of summer. Autumn 1945 brought an unfamiliar quiet to Ruth Ellison's office. Repatriation lists arrived folded like accordions, names creased where fingers had pressed too hard. The camp did not empty in a rush, it exhaled by degrees. Ruth began the final report before anyone asked, because memory without numbers spoils in storage. She unbound clinic cards, ran her finger along columns, and saw the war's domestic campaign in miniature. Milk raised, incidents lowered, boards laid, infections dropped, gardens planted, anemia eased. She charted each trend with the patience of a woman shelling peas. Lines moved like steady platoons. Fed at Geneva equivalents, she wrote, camps maintained order and labour output, preserving military resources and public peace. She avoided flourish. She used verbs that had earned their uniforms. She added a paragraph on gardens. Family plots likely reduced clinic load by roughly 1/10, and another on mud and boards, scorpions and bleach, the small enemies that never make parades yet consume a surgeon's time when ignored. Men who had argued coddling would be answered by arithmetic. Ruth placed ration scales beside incident reports and let the columns speak. Calorie reductions for non-workers, increased disciplinary issues and clinic visits. Restoration for workers and young children reversed both trends within 7 days. She footnoted dates. She appended mess rosters. Wally Beeman's freight tables sat like a drumbeat under the melody. Reefers on time, spoilage under 5% when schedules held, breakfast improved by minutes in the dark. In a drawer, she kept phrases for an audience that might ask later how dignity is measured amid wire. She would have said dignity counts in ounces and minutes where logistics and medicine share a border. She would have explained that in the worst weeks the camp did not grow cruel. It grew noisy, and noise is expensive. Quiet that returned with corrected scales was a strategic resource, the silence of men whose stomachs no longer argued with authority. She did not send those lines. She filed numbers instead. The day she finished, she walked the fence line not out of sentiment, but audit. Towers still had phones. Lamps still swung to floodlight at dusk. The cooler shed breathed a winter note even as afternoons softened. At the grocery, she signed a last delivery sheet and saw Lucia Romano buying flour and a jar ring from a clerk who had learned to make efficiency feel like neighbourliness. Nella pressed her nose to the glass case where butter sat like a promise kept. Back in the office, Ruth assembled the packet, clinic graphs, incident tables, requisition logs, Wally's schedules, a short narrative. She did not include adjectives she hadn't earned. She closed with a paragraph addressed quietly to history. The system succeeded when doctrine, logistics, and discipline moved in step. Humane treatment preserved order, labour, and public trust while affirming American claims to lawful conduct in war. She blotted the signature and felt calm, like a nurse who knows a fever has finally broken. Outside, a reefer door clanged like a period at the end of a sentence. A guard on the near tower scratched his jaw, looking more like a farmer at dusk than a soldier at post. The wind made the wire sing its neutral hymn. Ruth sealed the envelope with hands that counted faster than they trembled. The mail truck would carry the report to men who would file it, forget it, and then, if history behaved, find it again when someone asked whether mercy can be standardized. She believed the answer was yes. The proof had been plated 3 times a day. Steam breathed along the platform as if the train itself were deciding how to feel about endings. Autumn light fell in bars through gaps in freight cars, and chalked numbers on their flanks looked like problems solved in a hurry. Angelo Balestra stood with a small bag and the patience of a man who has learned to wait without surrendering posture. Repatriation moved like freight, scheduled, delayed, then suddenly in motion. A Red Cross crate sat under a bench with a label that had travelled more than most men. The camp did not empty in a procession. It broke into departures, each the size of a handshake. Wally Beeman watched from the yard office window as the reefer tracks held empty for once, the cars out on routes where milk and fruit no longer had to find barracks in the dark. He felt the oddness like a missing wrench in his palm. The schedule still kept time even when freight was farewell. He checked a thermometer out of habit and smiled at a number that meant nothing essential had forgotten how to work. Lucia Romano tied Nella's scarf against a morning that bit less than last month. The grocery felt normal in a way that startled her. A small-town store with a clerk whose hands made coin and scrip dance smoothly, a humming case, a handwritten note about a late delivery and a blown tyre. She bought a flour sack and a tin of buttons. She set an orange on the counter and looked at it the way a person looks at a photograph. The clerk slid a second orange across with a shrug that said, "Rules can make room for decency." Ruth Ellison crossed the platform with a list and the dark square of an envelope tucked under her arm. The final report headed for district. She had slept well for the first time in months, a sleep free of math. A sentry tipped his cap with the reflex of a man easing back toward civilian habits. If she felt pride, it was for a system that held even when opinions shook it. She nodded once and saved her words for the next requisition some other post would need. The train breathed again. A conductor called a time that felt round enough to be true. Angelo climbed aboard and sat by a window that needed cleaning. He looked back once. He did not see watchtowers. He saw a cooler shed, a grocery, and rows of garden beds, all lined like careful stitches. He decided, for later, to say that America had a system for feeding even its enemies, that temperature could be made to obey orders, and that instructions could be given without rage and still be obeyed. Wally locked the yard office and watched an empty reefer consist roll by, doors latched, cars clean, the short train as punctual as if loaded. Precision, he thought, is its own cargo, and men who live by it do not set it down because a war arranges to end. He could feel the country shifting, like a great machine downshifting to idle without dying, and felt grateful for the parts that had never shown off. He imagined clocks ticking in factories that would now make tractors and toasters still on time. Lucia and Nella stood apart from the crowd to peel the contraband second orange. The rind came off in a ribbon. Nella tucked it in her pocket because children understand talismans. Ruth caught the scent and let herself close her eyes for a heartbeat, seeing charts flatten and lines descend like well-drilled companies. She opened them to an ordinary station working right. The guard near the steps adjusted his hat as if it were suddenly his again. Couplers knocked like knuckles and the platform leaned forward a whisper. Angelo raised a hand. Wally answered with 2 fingers from the brim. Ruth nodded. Lucia lifted the orange as if toasting and then laughed because nobody salutes fruit. The train took the curve and the fence wrote quick, bright lines across the windows like a signature finished in a hurry. The day exhaled. Somewhere a compressor turned on and a cat chose a sunstrip, and the camp practiced being ordinary, which is another name for peace. Years later, when Nella traced a pencil from Texas to Italy on a schoolroom map, the line looked too straight to be true. Her mother told her it wasn't a road, it was a timetable. The orange that detonated a small rebellion in the throat on a January morning in 1944 had become a proof, repeated whenever anyone asked what America felt like in the years when the world came apart and had to be rebuilt with schedules, welds, and will. From a historian's height, the intimacy hardens into numbers that still feel like people when read correctly. Roughly 425,000 Axis POWs in the United States by May 1945, about 50,000 of them Italians, hundreds of main and branch camps, reefer cars that made breakfast a matter of physics, waste kept under 5% when the line held. About 265,000 POW labourers in American agriculture across the war years, field days that transformed scarcity into suppers. The impossible part is production running ahead of imagination and still finding time for mercy. In 1944, American factories built on the order of 96,000 aircraft, a pace that averages to roughly 1 airplane every 6 minutes across the year. A single plant at Willow Run approached a bomber an hour at peak. A Liberty ship once went from keel to launch in a long weekend. These feats do not belong to parades alone. They explain how a country could refrigerate mercy for the family of an enemy while hammering steel for victory overseas. Ruth Ellison's final report reads, in one light, like the war's thesis sentence distilled for civilians. Feed at Geneva equivalents and you get order, labour and health. Cut calories and you pay elsewhere with noise and disease. Restore them and watch curves soften within 7 days. Wally Beeman's penciled freight sheets provide the drumbeat. Hit 0340 and breakfast tastes like trees. Miss 0500 and breakfast tastes like apology. The cold does not lie. Angelo Balestra's quiet is another kind of evidence. The silence of a man whose hunger no longer argues with instructions. The doctrine that beat fascism did not fetishize cruelty. It standardized decency. It turned ethics into logistics and proved every morning at mess and noon at the grocery case that a free people can scale kindness without wasting strength. The camps were not utopias. There were bad days, ration cuts that bruised morale, mistakes under pressure. What matters in the long view is the correction. Complaints climbed a chain and came down as signatures that moved calories like squads. Process became policy, became peace. Modern audiences gape, and should, at the idea that a nation fought on 2 oceans, fed prisoners to soldier standards, rolled a bomber every hour in one factory, and still found the patience to move oranges to a child behind wire by dawn. The astonishment is a kind of gratitude. It is also a warning written in the ledger's margin. Capacity is not a law of nature. It is a choice renewed daily by people who keep thermometers honest and clocks trustable. Forget them and the system phrase. Honour them and it hums. Nella kept an old rind in a box until it dulled and went to dust. By then the household had words for what the scent first promised. It wasn't nostalgia, it was civics. They had learned, because the war taught it, that freedom's price can be counted in tonnage and timetables as well as blood, and that an orange delivered on time to the child of an enemy says something essential about the flag in whose shadow the delivery was made. If asked what victory felt like, Lucia would point to a clock and a kitchen and say, on time.